if I'm interrupting, but I believe you guys are muted.
Great. Thank you for interrupting.
We're capable.
Thank you.
Good, good. So with that, why don't we do a quick introductions and then we'll, somebody is not muted, it sounds.
Sorry, I just got up.
Okay. Good. So I am David Durfee, represent Shaftesbury, Sunderland, and Glastonbury down in Bennington County. Go around there.
I'm Leland Morgan. I represent Grand Isle County and the western portion of the town of Milton, Chittenden County.
Jed Lipsky, Lamoille One, Stowe, and maybe over toward Jefferson.
Yeah.
Richard Nelson, Orleans, one, Derby.
Michelle Boslin, Wyndham 3, Westminster, Rockingham, and Brookline in northern Wyndham County.
Greg Bird, Cabot, Danville, and Peachum.
Have a supernaut, Barnard, Pomfret, Bridgewater, West Hartford.
Then Macedonia. And David, I'll let you introduce whoever might have joined us on Zoom as well.
Yeah, unless Stephen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm Steve Wilson, owner and founder of VT Vineyards, business dedicated to driving viticulture in Vermont. We build vineyards, do commercial maintenance, and advocate for commercial producers in any way we can.
Where's your business located, Steve?
We're out of Underhill, but we work statewide. And forgive the avatar today. I would have liked to be in person, but I have had the flu for the last week.
Well, you'd be right at home here, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
But okay, well, hope you get well soon. Good, nice to meet you. And David, we'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, I know I've met at least some of you before, but David Keck, I live in Cambridge, Vermont, Jeffersonville, Cambridge, Jefferson. Our address is officially North Cambridge, I believe, but Jeffersonville, Field Farm, yeah. I grew up in Vermont, grew up over in West Newbury, Vermont, and left for a while in the wine business for 20 years now. I moved back in 2020, moved to Milton actually, which was the only place my wife and I could find somewhere to stay. Since my parents were both over 70, we decided that going to their house was a bad idea. And ended up leasing the Boyden Vineyards, which I think most of you are probably familiar with, from David and Linda Boyden in 2020. I've been farming that vineyard since then. And in last year, took over the viticulture at Golden Dog Farm up on Pratt Road in Jeffersonville, planted 4,500 more vines over the past, well, last July, really. It was a heck of a month. And I know and I'm glad that is up there. Some of this presentation I gave last year, so some of it may be hopefully not too redundant, but I think this year we really wanted to. And the reason Stephen's on the call, he and I are working closely on working some new trellising. And also Stephen is deeply involved in a lot of new vineyards and plantings throughout the state. So he's got a lot of insight as far as the current status of viticulture in Vermont. And we meet regularly and have been talking a lot about how we can help viticulture grow in the state as a lucrative and potentially really viable form of agriculture in a pretty challenging time for agriculture, which you all know better than anyone, I would imagine. I do have a handout. I'll probably wait and go through this first, if that's all right. And then this is kind of the, a little bit of a synopsis. So why am I here? Why do we need support? A lot of the reason is that viticulture in this state, unlike when you look at viticulture, as far as regions that have been growing grapes for an extended period of time, probably the most recent to come online would be Oregon. Rapidly after Oregon, vines were first planted in Oregon, you had an influx of huge money from outside, whether it be France or California, pumping millions of dollars into the viticultural industry and developing infrastructure. Vermont's been growing grapes for, well, Dave Boyden and Linda and Snow Farm, the Lanes and Snow Farm were the first ones to really plant commercial vineyards, and that was in the 90s. So we're very, very new at this, but thus far we've had amazing press. nationally and internationally supporting what we're doing here. And I think that's outgrown rapidly what we produce. And so now we're in a place where we have a lot of young growers. We don't have a huge influx of capital. And the challenge with growing grapes is if you're not in a region that's been growing for hundreds of thousands of years, planting vineyards and establishing them is extremely expensive, and you don't see that return on investment until year 3 or 4. So that said, hopefully this is, so I'll talk through some of the numbers. I think it's pretty evident as a value added crop how lucrative grape growing can be in the state. The challenge we have right now is we've got a bunch of young, very excited growers who don't have capital, nor is capital really available in the form of loans, because most people want to see some sort of return on their investment before year 3. Yeah, please.
Yeah, just I actually had to look up the word viticulture this morning. So I mean,
Yeah.
winemaking, but is it exclusively with grapes, or is it also wine that is made from other things? Like in my area, there's a winery that makes wine out of rhubarb, for example. So does that include all kinds of wine, or is it just grape-based, like
So
exclusive grape?
I
wine?
worked at the Vermont Grape and Wine Council, so we do represent some folks who, and we're talking actually of joining with the folks who produce cider, hard cider
Yep.
specifically in the state to
Yep.
kind of, a lot of what we do there's a lot of crossover.
Mhm.
On the Vermont Grape and Wine Council, we definitely have people doing fruit wines that are
Yep.
not grapes.
Okay.
Most of where I think and I hesitate to say this because I don't know the industry that well
Mhm.
for rhubarb wine, blueberry wine, cranberry wine, etc. I think the financial potential really sits in grape wine production
Mhm.
for the most part. And that's kind of where I have the most numbers and experience myself. I think right now, and I've got some of the press in this presentation, but we're seeing, New York Times articles, Travel and Leisure, a number of international and national publications that are touting the quality of what we're doing in the state. Right now, we just aren't able to supply the demand. We've got people asking for the wine. Personally, I have people in 4 different states asking us to distribute in the states, and we just don't make enough wine to support the demand, which is a good problem to have, but it's a hard one to address. So what we're looking for is essentially some sort of annual beginning, right? And a financial grant that could be essentially given to grape growers as opposed to the larger pot. And this is one of the challenges, and my colleagues and I kind of bemoan the fact that we've all been applying consistently for the grants that exist in the state, which are there and are generous, but unfortunately none of us have been successful in achieving many of these grants, at least not in the past 5 years. And I think that has to do with both the competitive nature of the grants at this point, which I think we're all aware of. And I know Working Lands is down to $1 million this year. But also the boards and the people determining where those funds go know almost nothing about viticulture, and there's never actually somebody in grape growing on any of those boards. So I think that we've been somewhat hamstrung by the situation, and it becomes a cycle of, well, we can't get the funds, so we can't plant more grapes, which means we can't grow as an industry, and so on and so forth. So what I'm proposing is that $250,000 divided amongst growers exclusively for viticulture, not as a generic agricultural grant, could result in $1 million in wine produced in the next 3 to 4 years, leading not just tax revenue, but we're seeing a huge amount of tourist business and people asking to come to tasting rooms and to visit vineyards. And I think we've all seen what that's done for economies in other states. I lived in Texas for 15 years, 12 years, which I don't admit readily in Vermont, especially being a Vermonter. But Texas has the largest, by dollar amount, the largest wine industry in the country, which I think most people would be very surprised by.
Really?
But because wine country is right outside Austin. So people are able, there's certainly people flying into San Francisco and going north to Napa and Sonoma, but that stuff is a much more expensive proposition than hopping in a car from Austin, going out, having some barbecue and tasting wine made at any of the hundreds of wineries that are right in Hill Country right there. It's amazing. They are, by dollar amount, their tourism industry for wine is higher than anywhere else in the country.
Wow.
And that is driven almost exclusively by press, locale, and the fact that they're promoting it hugely within their own state. people aren't traveling to Austin necessarily to taste wine, but when they're there, they're tasting wine. And I think Vermont has a lot of a similar situation where people are coming here to experience Vermont. If they can visit a winery while they're skiing or while they're, hiking in Stowe, then they will. And people are constantly, I work at Golden Dog Farm where people pay to come and hang out with golden retrievers for an hour. I've never seen anything like it. And they're constantly asking, what else can I do now that I'm here? And I think having the ability to walk through vineyards with people and have tasting rooms and things that are supported by the industry, there's no way that that would be less successful.
Do we have that right now or not?
There are a handful of wineries that have hospitality available. Shelburne, obviously, Boyden still does tastings, although they're not producing their own growing grapes anymore. Snow Farm is still doing. We had a tasting room until 2024, but we lost 90% in the frost in 2023. I will see you all tomorrow when I'm here again with the Farm Security Fund, which is different, but also why we diversified and moved up to Golden Dog Farm, which doesn't have the frost issues. So, so what can you do? Really quickly, just going through some of the other states in the nation that might not, well, New York, I think we all know has a decent wine industry. The fact that they just put $1 million this year into a global reach grant is pretty outstanding. The fact that they're moving to putting $1 million into what they can do outside is pretty outstanding. But Colorado, Ohio, and New Mexico might not necessarily be recognized by most people as some sort of big wine regions. But the New Mexico Vineyard Restoration Fund came into existence 2 years ago, I want to say, and it's $1 million just for vine material to plant and encourage the industry. British Columbia, Canada has been supporting the wine industry for a very long time and putting money into new growth, but they just put $70 million into a replant program in British Columbia. So I already, yeah.
What's it cost to establish an acre of vine?
Hold that question.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you.
I'm gonna definitely get to it. So as I said, the upfront cost is the challenge. We're about to get to that. The return on investment, planting a grapevine, you're looking at not harvesting a grape off that vine for 3 years. In 4 years, you come into full production. We also are in the position that we don't have a lot of infrastructure. When I need, if something breaks, if the implement on my tractor breaks, my sprayer breaks. I had this issue with Ellison Estate, their sprayer broke down, and we were basically trailering my tractor and sprayer back and forth to Grand Isle for a couple of weeks just until they could get back up and running. But we're all kind of using the same equipment and there isn't a lot of extra in the state. So it's very expensive right now. Pruning grapevines and working in, and Stephen can speak to this probably better than anybody I know, training people to work in vineyards is just very different agriculturally than any other crop that we have in the state. And because we have no infrastructure to speak of, we all essentially do the work ourselves. I think Stephen has now one full-time employee and one part-time employee working with him. Most of the vineyards in the state are either bootstrapping just within the family or have 2 to 3 employees, because it's very difficult to have a crew to do pruning. Where I talked to a buddy of mine who has vineyards in the Finger Lakes. He has 14 acres. And I'm like, have you started pruning yet? When are you going to prune? And he said, oh, I just have a crew come in and do it in a week at the end of April, as late as I can. Like, oh, that's lovely. That's going to be nice.
In Isle of Mont, they have a crew of sheep and
Yeah,
takes care of the grass underneath.
That's
Not pruning, but
no, but I think I could digress on sheep and the potential for, there was a shepherd who was actually bringing his flock to multiple vineyards throughout the state, because all of us would love to have sheep in there. It's just not infrastructure necessarily can start.
Not goats.
Goats will eat the vines. Yeah. Yeah, they'll eat anything. They'll eat anything and everything.
they'll climb too.
Yeah. So here's what you were asking about. What does it take? Well, this is what the benefit of having a 5-acre vineyard looks like. At full production, you're yielding essentially 2 tons of grapes per acre. That's low. I know Shelburne right now, and talking to Ethan, who's the main grape grower there, said 4 tons per acre is what we're shooting for to be lucrative, as lucrative as possible. They also have a lot more employees. at 10 tons of grapes, you're looking at 1,500 gallons of juice and 600 plus cases of wine for that 5-acre plot, which is not a huge plot. And I know I talk about this later, but also we're growing grapes on non-prime agricultural land. And in fact, we prefer non-prime ag land, which makes it hard to get any support from the land trust. As wonderful as that group is, and I have nothing but good things to say, except for the fact that when I've looked to get land into trust, they've said, well, is it prime ag? And I said, no, it's not. And we don't want prime ag because it actually is too fertile for grape growing. We wanted them to struggle more. The juice produced is more concentrated and makes better wine. But then you ended at a conflict of interest there. At $20 per bottle, which is low right now, Vermont wine is some of the most expensive wine in the market. That would be about $150,000 in revenue with a tasting room, and you're doing sort of direct consumer sales. You're looking at close to $300,000 in wine produced per year on 5 acres. Which is a relatively small plot, I think, in agricultural terms.
So $20 per bottle is considered low.
That's low. That's my numbers are based on that as a just to have kind of a round number. Most people are charging between $35 and $40 per bottle of wine for Vermont wine for grapes that are grown in the state. I say 20 because if that leaves the state, and let's say right now we produce about 500 cases of wine. If I'm making 2,000 cases of wine, probably half of that will need to leave Vermont, which means that I'm going to, once it goes into wholesale, we don't make as much. So.
What are the wholesale price on those 10 ton of grapes? Like someone wanted to grow grapes and not be a vintner.
So it very much is a value-added crop. A ton of grapes right now, Stephen, you're selling that for about $2 a pound, is that right?
Yeah, that's accurate. $2 a pound, but only to a certain volume, right? If you know, if it's 10 tons, it's probably going to be cheaper. It's probably going to be a $1.50. The other thing I'll note on the $20 a bottle is that if we are increasing production, accessing different kinds of funding to increase planted acreage, the dollar per bottle is going to have to decrease. So it'll be closer to that 20 number, I believe, rather than the 35, 40 number we're at now, because scarcity will be less of an influence.
Sure.
Which right now, wine in Vermont is remarkably scarce, so the prices are remarkably high.
Yeah. And it's the combination, right? It's supply and demand like anything else. With more supply, the prices will also be able to drop. Yeah.
Thank you. David, we've taken a lot of testimony on current use for agriculture. Are there any carve outs that you're aware of that a 10-acre vineyard or a 5-acre vineyard to be eligible for
common use?
Yeah.
Or our current use. Grape growing is 100% eligible for current use.
Even on
As far as I think it
acres?
is, I think it is fine under. I don't know 100%.
Yeah, we'll save that for.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know we looked at carving out a vineyard in a plot that was already in current use, and it was a much larger area. So I don't know whether it was because it was already in current use that it was okay.
No, a follow-up question. I mean, you enlighten us about the Texas vineyard industry, New Mexico. Where is the optimism with regard to temperature and climate and winds?
Yeah.
Out Grand Isle County, Ellison Vineyard, and that is a little different ecosystem.
100%.
David, I could take that one, David, if you don't mind.
Great, love it. Yep.
The optimism can be found due north. So my one of the driving forces behind my optimism is Quebec. Spending a lot of time in Quebec and seeing the resources that they've put into the wine culture there, because there is a heavy French influence. It's a really similar climate. we have a lot of the same hurdles, and they have navigated it in a way that has similar to what David was saying about Texas. They've had a lot of success marketing it themselves to just heavily locally to the tourism that is there. We in Vermont can do the same as we have a similar lake effect off of Champlain, similar highs and lows, similar degree days. There's similar soil, and really the difference is investment. We don't, and culture, right? The Vermont doesn't have a significant wine culture, whereas, you know, French-speaking Canada does. So that's where I see the most comparable and successful wine market. New York is right there too. It's similar, upstate near Niagara, and even, you know, off of the Finger Lakes as well, but primarily Quebec. And I don't know if that directly answers the question, but that's where I'm drawing most of my optimism from.
The last part of that is Grand Isle, let's say the elevation is about 100 feet above sea level, whereas in Jeffersonville or the northern slopes of between the Worcester Greens, it might be 1,200 or 900.
And
Yeah,
see, but I think I can speak to.
So is it the Laurentians and Eastern Townships that are having success, or the more floodplain?
Well, and correct me if you see this differently, Stephen, but so we grow at Boyden, and those vineyards have been doing well since the mid-90s. I think as we're obviously seeing a change in the climate, the challenge that we face, I would say, moving forward, the one that makes most of it, the thing that makes us most nervous is the increase in precipitation. Just because fungal growth is the one thing that we struggle against more than anything else, but that's every grower in Vermont. It doesn't really matter what your crop is. Fungal growth tends to be, there are pests, but still the dampness of the climate is the biggest challenge. The grapes that we work with, and I've got a little bit of this in the presentation, we work with hybrid grape varieties that have actually been cultivated to survive the temperature here. Essentially, they are hardy down to however cold it's going to get for the most part. If it gets much below 20 degrees below zero and stays there for a very long period of time, then maybe we've got a problem. But really, right now, it doesn't get cold enough that it's an issue. They've been cultivated to be resilient to the fungal diseases that most bother grapes. And so we're as set up for success right now with the climate being what it is as any other grape growing region. What's going to happen next? We don't really know. Things get warmer, we are not going to suffer any. The grapes are going to be more successful with warmer winters. I will be sad about that, but I think we all will be. But I think also there are a lot of other grape varieties that are successful in warmer places. We are the coldest growing, one of the coldest growing regions. The grape varieties that we work with were cultivated and developed in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Sort of, they're the only comparable region. As things get warmer, there are a lot more doors that open with respect to what we can plant and what we grow.
Representative Nelson.
Stephen, isn't Knowlton, Quebec a big grape area for Quebec?
Yeah, I mean the Eastern Townships is kind of where the majority of the vines are planted, right? And it's like hundreds of thousands of acres versus, I don't know if we've touched on this yet in this presentation, but we in Vermont have just shy of 200 acres. So
Knowlton is just north of where we are, and
yeah,
they have that similar exact same climate. Whereas you get closer to Montreal, it's more temperate, like the Champlain Valley.
Yeah, and that does give us a little bit of hope as far as the less accessible and harsher climates in Vermont go, such as where David is planting and where I live in Underhill. But to speak directly to your point about the Champlain Islands, there's a lot of local optimism around that particular climate. Like you said, it's more temperate, more consistent, less frost. And we've seen significant investment in vine production in the islands over the last several years. And we'd like to see it continue. I think that we could have you know, our own kind of like our own little sub-region on the islands that mitigates risk. And I am always pushing for folks that either have land or are considering planting on the islands to do so, because I think it's an absolutely brilliant investment and one of the safest in the state.
Stephen, just before we go on, is the production in Quebec that you were just talking about, is that largely hybrid varieties?
It is. It's both hybrid varieties and vinifera. The varieties we're used to: Cabernet, Chardonnay, Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc. These varieties are much less cold resistant and require more care. The way that they've gotten around that issue is with a fabric called geotextile that was created by an engineer outside of Montreal maybe 10, 12 years ago. And it's simply a agricultural fabric that they lay over the vines over winter so that they are insulated. And then they can treat they're essentially adapting the climate for the vines, you know, to better grow the vines. And it's more profitable to produce vinifera still today. The consumer has not been convinced of hybrid wines yet to the same degree, but we're on our way, and eventually they'll have to be.
Yeah. Well, I think anyway, we'll dive into hybrid grapes a little bit. It is the way that they're able to grow vinifera north of the border.
Yeah.
The infrastructure associated is very expensive. And that's a lot of the reason that it isn't practiced in a lot of other places, because you really need in the tens to hundreds of acres to make it viable from a cost benefit perspective.
And I'll say too, David, that's true, but as well, it's worth it for these producers because of the cultural heritage involved, right? These are French varieties produced by French people with French ancestry. And so it's worth it to them. In many cases, people don't do this, and they'll grow hybrids in Quebec as it's not as culturally relevant.
Yeah. So those are the quick numbers about I'm sorry, were you going to say something? This is kind of where we are now. We've got about 170 acres, probably more than that, since I last did an assessment, but a lot of that, and Stephen does a lot of this work. There is a fair amount that's being planted sort of as hobbyist vineyards throughout the state. And so those numbers have to do more with what's sort of registered commercially. About 28 wineries are producing on a commercial level. And another one of the aspects that is pretty important to the ethos of farming grapes in Vermont is that most of the vineyards that are producing on a commercial level now are focusing on, if not organic or biodynamic methods, then regenerative and sustainable agriculture. And it's a huge part of what I would argue makes Vermont wine sell at the premium that it does outside of the state, especially. So quick comparison with national statistics. If you look at the US, there are over $8 billion tax dollars in state and local taxes being paid on consumption, right? So that accounts for state and local taxes as well as excise taxes applying to specific retail. In wine in the state of Vermont, we see, and this is all just in wine production, 21.3 million. In state and local taxes, we're looking at a $17 billion tourist industry in the country, and less than $1 million in the state of Vermont, to tell you where we sit on that scale, which is negligible, but I think it's something that could rapidly change. We have a huge tourist industry and people love to go to wineries. Vermont is currently lower on that list than any state other than Hawaii, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Mississippi, Rhode Island, and Delaware, and I think I'm okay. That we're above, I'm grateful that at least we see more tourist dollars than Hawaii as far as wine culture is concerned, although there's a little bit of pineapple wine being produced. That's pretty good, to be honest. But there's a huge amount, all this to say, there's a huge amount of headspace for us to grow into. This is just some of the press. I mean, Travel and Leisure, the New York Times, Alice Firing. And to Stephen's point, hybrid grapes have been a challenge for the state of Vermont because they're not as familiar. You know, walk into any group of people and say, do you like Pinot Noir? Oh, do you like Frontenac? People are going to recognize Pinot Noir before they recognize Frontenac. But I think the press recently, and those two articles that I listed at the bottom or linked at the bottom, were in the past 2 years. In the Smithsonian magazine and also Wine Enthusiast, we're seeing a huge outpouring of support for hybrid grapes, especially as the climate becomes more and more challenging. This isn't just in super cold regions like Vermont, but also California, places where they're finding that they're more disease resistant, that they're more climate stable, so resilient with things like heat and drought, as well as too much humidity and moisture. There's also a push overseas, and we're seeing it in France. I mean, France is probably one of the most stringent places with respect to wine law, and they're actually allowing for the first time ever legal growth of hybrid varieties, where before it was very much sort of blacklisted varieties, purely because of their resilience to disease and to the vagaries of the climate right now. So it's a lot of what we do. I think we're also, over the past 15 years, we've seen so many more developments in these varieties that are making the wines that we produce that much more delicious and successful, but also easier to grow. As far as the wine market is concerned, having worked in some of the major markets as a sommelier and restaurateur before I came back to the state and got into farming, we're seeing in the wine culture a desire for not only a sense of place and a story behind what people are drinking, but also a desire to try new and interesting things. And I think this is a huge amount of what is pushing the Vermont wine industry sort of ahead of the pack in a really interesting way. The farm to table movement is kind of the way we've done food in Vermont for an extremely long time. It's not a new thing. I think drinking what is produced in the state is less has less history. And I think from a beverage perspective, and I realize that this is the Committee on Agriculture, not the Committee on Alcohol Consumption, but we talk a lot about beer production and the spirits that are produced in the state, but we don't grow anything that goes into those. There's a very small amount of hop production that's pretty challenging. And some of that, and we've got some malting of barley going on. There's a little bit of rye production that's going on. But for the most part, the products that are going into beer and spirits are coming from out of the state. Wine production is one of the only industries where we really are actually growing everything that we're producing for the most part.
Representative Morgan, have a question.
Where does your root stock come from that you use to?
Yeah. So almost everybody right now is buying our root material from Andy Farmer. He and his wife India have a propagation farm in Pollitt.
Oh, right here in Vermont.
And actually, Andy and India are two of the few who've actually been successful in the past with grants and have established a truly amazing facility. And they supply hybrid grape material to much of the country, actually. They're producing something like 400,000 vines a year down there and have an amazing system in place.
Yeah, let's see.
David, Frontenac, is that the name of the hybrid grape or
one grape variety?
From the Frontenac area.
So it's named after, it was actually developed at the University of Minnesota in 1996. I think it was released for propagation. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of that, Stephen, I'm sure. Like a lot of Marquette is another grape variety that we focus on here that has had a lot of success. It wasn't released for propagation until 2004.
And
So these are
does
relatively-
Pollitt, farmed, are they growing those varieties?
They're growing all hybrid varieties. Yeah.
And are there dozens or hundreds?
Yeah, at least dozens, yeah, of varieties. I mean, just looking at Northeastern Vine Supply, what is available right now, there's probably 20 red varieties and 20 white varieties available for sale. And Representative, you asked about the price, sort of the return on investment and what the price of putting an acre in. I just handed out a sheet that has kind of a quick breakdown of what does it cost to plant and trellis 1 acre. And this is where the startup costs are challenging for us. So 1,000 vines, basically, we just planted 4,500 vines last year that we bought from Andy and planted at Golden Dog Farm, and also my sister has land in Heartland, Vermont. So planted in those 2 places, but 1,000 vines for 1 acre is about $4,300. It's about $4 a vine, give or take, plus delivery if you want that, or you can show up in your truck like I did and pick them up. It was a heavy load for my little truck. Labor for planting, that's if you're paying people to come out and do it. My wife and I planted almost all of our vines, so a lot of us are bootstrapping this. Trellising and labor, again, Stephen could add a lot of insight into these numbers. That is one number based on a recent quote, but overall, it's anywhere between $5,000 and $10,000 to trellis an acre of vines. And that's where a lot of the expense comes in, just in materials alone, and then also the labor associated. Once it's trellised, that trellising system, if Stephen and his crew put it in, is going to last 20 years at a minimum. It's not a one-time, it is a one-time investment. Occasionally you're updating wiring posts, things like that, but you're not reinstalling a whole trellis system every year. So you're looking at anywhere between $10,000 and $14,000 an acre for the installation of the vineyard. That's the challenge, is if you're putting in a 5-acre vineyard and you're looking at $50,000 to $75,000 for a starting farmer, that's a hefty investment that, especially when you're not going to see the return on that investment for 3 to 4 years.
You ought to try milking cows.
Oh, trust me. Yeah. I grew up, and this is the conversation, right? I grew up with dairy farms on both sides of me, and I know what challenges that industry is seeing right now.
I have a new goal in life.
Close to,
You,
nice rolling.
in mud season, you come up, we work together.
It's a good time to start working.
What kind of soil types does it like? Does it grow on clay, or does it like well drained or fairly well drained?
Drainage is important, so we've put in some tile, but for the most part, we're on pretty sandy loam, and it does decently well. When you get down closer to the lake, clay can be a bit heavy, but with some drainage, it'll work. And people have planted in everything from blasting, like dynamiting granite out of a hillside and planting that, to clay in a riverbed. And they're kind of weeds. They're pretty resilient. As long as their feet aren't too wet, they do pretty well. Would you agree?
Yeah, as far as soil goes, the health is significant, but the most important factor is that the environment in the ground is not anaerobic. So you just need, it has to drain one way or another, or the water table has to be low enough that the roots are getting oxygen. So this is usually not an issue. If you go and find a wetland and plant vines, they're not going to go. Avoid a wetland and you're going to be all right.
So anywhere corn did good last summer or the summer before, vines will do well.
I just planted in a cornfield at my sister's property.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you're talking Cambridge and Underhill, and from the Northeast Kingdom perspective, you can grow bananas, I can't.
Right. Well,
But Knowlton, Quebec, I know Knowlton, Quebec, and I know they have vineyards up there. And that's
Northeast Kingdom, NEK Vineyards just put in a bunch more vines right around the guys who, got the Hill family. Not Sean, but his brother, just put a bunch of vines right up in there.
down there in Greensboro. Yeah.
Newport might be a little chilly, but.
No different, actually lower elevation.
Oh, so
And it's got the lake. It's got
And you got the lake,
too.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
perfect.
And I know we've got,
About 5 minutes
Yeah.
now, so I don't know if you wanted to
yeah,
highlight anything.
well, and I think, we talked to some extent about if there is some carbon sequestering, there's a lot of carbon sequestering benefit, especially with cover crops, and you can see the sheep. I think I guess the ask here is really how do we go about moving the dial? And we just bootstrapped and put it in on credit last year to put 4,500 vines in the ground. I still need to come up with $50,000 to trellis them, and I don't know how we're going to do that. And I'm not the only one. Ellison Estate did the same thing. And then there are a bunch of other people who want to put vines in the ground, but haven't done it because the upfront cost is exorbitant. We've talked with Abby Willard and with the folks at Working Lands. They're on board with helping us if they can. And I in no way want to hamstring what they're doing. And I know the budget's been cut there as well, or at least it's smaller than it's been. I guess my question for you all is, how do we go about coming? And I put $250,000 as an amount that would take 5 people who are growing grapes and probably come close to doubling their production in 3 years. I think the return on the investment is certainly there. If you're talking about putting $10,000 to $15,000 into an acre that's going to produce $30,000 in wine every year, give or take. I think the return on investment is certainly there. I guess I'm asking whether this is something that we should be working with Working Lands to cut out a section that is exclusively for viticulture, so we're not competing in essentially a very uneven playing field, or whether this is something that we should be working to create a grant that is specific. And I know funds are tight. I'm not blind to the fact that agriculture is struggling in the state as well.
Have you gotten, you mentioned you talked to Abby, when you've had applications or when others and your colleagues have that weren't accepted because, as you pointed out, they're oversubscribed tremendously. Have you gotten feedback on what might be useful in another year putting together a successful application?
We've gotten, I can only speak for myself, and I've gotten feedback on our applications, but it's been pretty general as far as some more numbers here would be helpful. A little bit more explanation here might be helpful. It is certainly a work in progress, and there may be that block could be picked in a different way, I think. But I think, again, one of the big challenges, and I don't mean to necessarily put this as the scapegoat, but I think one of the big challenges is that we're working in an agricultural setting that doesn't understand what we're doing necessarily, despite the potential. But I think that's a big part of it. At least that's my perspective.
Well, I think certainly having you come in and present to us is a step in the right direction. And if you haven't already visited our colleagues downstairs in the Senate Ag Committee, I would encourage you to see if they can make time too.
No, I've reached out and we haven't found a time yet, but hopefully soon.
They don't have as much. They usually only have mornings, so they don't have as much time to. So it's just you're already running up against that. But
is there a benefit, do you think? In the Vermont Grape and Wine Council, we have some budget. It's not a huge budget. Is putting a grant to finding someone to support a grant and getting a lobbyist in here to push on that? Is that a benefit or is that annoying?
I'm not sure I would want to give you advice on that.
And I realize that you're not the right people necessarily to ask the question. But we're just trying to figure out, and this is a bunch of us that are not versed in the system necessarily, but desperately need the help. So
Can I just ask, we've taken a step in the right direction here, and that's one thing, that's great. What is the next step that we should take to keep the momentum, to stay in the right direction? Other than meeting with downstairs, what's our next best course of action here?
Have you had conversations with your individual representatives and senators?
we have.
Yeah, I think that would be maybe the next step. And seeing what their thoughts are.
Seeing if we can get something.
You don't have a full-time lobbyist.
No.
Keep telling the story.
Representative Byrd has a question.
Thank you, Chair. Who's in charge of the taxes that are gathered from the sales of alcohol in our state. Which department is that, and
Department of
what are the
Liquor.
funds used for now? Is there a way to tap into that to help fund?
So that's, yeah, interesting thought. So I'm not even sure that I know we have a Department of Liquor and Lottery. There is, in addition to sales tax, there is.
We pay excise tax as well.
Yeah. And I'm not sure whether it's already dedicated to some program or if it goes in the general fund.
So it goes into education.
Lottery goes to education.
Lottery does, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's another aspect of this, and we're constantly, like, there is a lobbyist for the Craft Beer Association that works a little bit with us. That's the whole other side that we meet with the other committees that deal with alcohol regulations, because we're also a bit hamstrung by those regulations, because they were written for the beer industry 15 years ago. So
It would seem fair to me that some of those funds are
I,
enhancing the industry, you know?
I like where your head's at with that.
No, you could almost create a revolving fund,
Mhm.
fund it, and then as they come online, start paying it back, even if it was a low interest loan
Yeah.
guaranteed.
It's finding a loan that had, with the knowledge that the payback period is going to be what it is.
You haven't even got into the price of putting in the vats and.
Oh, the winery is a whole nother challenge, but most of us, again, are working, we insulated our barn and we work with a very low budget, very, I guess, low tech winemaking, but it's been very successful so far. Shelburne, Boyden and Snow are the three that are sort of full on
Say,
tech wineries.
say hi to Bob for me,
Cranberry Bob?
Les Nukowski.
Yeah, I will. Borrowed his rototiller, that's cheap.
Well, we can certainly continue this conversation, offline, and thank you for coming in, David.
Thank you for the time. I really appreciate it.
Joining us as well.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We are scheduled to have testimony next from Outdoor Recreation Day folks.
They're up.